Do you not think that
Yeah, so
there's a clear indication that there's looser standards being applied?
one of the basic principles is that Israel has the right to defend itself.
I suppose the ultimate question, and you've partly answered this, is whether or not it's justified for the UK to be giving this amount of weapons to Israel, and whether you think there is some kind of double standard from a Western perspective.
When you were in government, you opposed providing arms to the Saudi Air Force for fears of Saudi involvement in Yemen. There seems to be a bit of a double standard when that comes to providing arms to Israel and investigation about international law. Do you think the UK should be providing arms to Israel? And do you think there should be greater strictness on looking at how these arms are being used?
Well, the rules are very strict and they're very explicit, as I discovered because I was the Secretary of State who had ultimate responsibility. The other government departments have to agree to a decision on arm exports, whether controversial. There is a very strict set of criteria which govern arms export licenses, and you're very much bound by legal matters. Ministers can't just say, "Oh, I don't like this government, I'm not going to approve arms exports." When I was the Secretary of State, there were several occasions where I did stop arms export licenses. One was in relation to Saudi Arabia, and that was because of the evidence which had emerged about the bombing of hospitals. There was a human rights issue there, a humanitarian issue. It was actually quite strongly opposed by my Conservative colleagues who didn't agree that I should withdraw the licenses. We had a very messy compromise in the last days of the government. In fact, while we were out campaigning on the streets, I was on the telephone to the Minister of Defence making my case that we restrict the licenses. In relation to Israel, we did the same during the Gaza War. I did insist that the response on the Israeli side was disproportionate. We worked with Nick Clegg. We did win the argument in government that there had to be some restriction. We did restrict arms export. But by the time it became effective, the fighting had stopped, so it became redundant. But we did take a stand on that issue. But I would add, it's not, the morality of these things is not altogether straightforward. I mean, there are cases where arms exports were restricted, which I didn't agree with. I mean, a good example was there was a company in Aberdeen, part of the oil supply chain, which had invented these special devices which could rescue submariners if they were trapped underwater. Very sophisticated technology. And I thought, this is fine. They wanted to supply it to Russia. And Russia, of course, had that horrible Kursk disaster, which you may remember, when I think 100 submariners were killed by being trapped. And I thought that this doesn't affect defense capability. But my colleagues in government took the view that, Russia is an adversary. We should not be supplying them with any kit of military value. So I was overruled, but I wanted to supply something covered by licensing.
If you don't mind, I'll be a little bit more specific then. I do agree in general that there should be strict restrictions, and I am aware that there are in general strict restrictions. I just think in the case of Israel and the current situation in Gaza, perhaps they're being applied more loosely. I mean, something like 90% of hospitals in Gaza are no longer existent. The death toll is around 160,000, most of which are civilians. And yet the UK has only stopped supplying around 10% of arms. It seems to me that there's a pretty significant likelihood that more than 10% are being used in the broaching of international law. Do you not think that there's a clear indication that there's looser standards being applied to arms being supplied?
I think it's a genuinely tricky issue, actually. One of the basic principles is that Israel has the right to defend itself, and they are actually or potentially under attack from Iran, and we've seen this. And so trying to create a defensive system which protects them seems to be legitimate. On the other hand, the reaction within the Gaza Strip, and you've quoted a couple of points about it, does seem to be disproportionate. So you have a very difficult balancing act, actually. absolutely. And it's rather similar to the case which I had 10 years ago when the Gaza War was continuing. And we did agree eventually that some arms associated with the Air Force, which were being used to bomb civilian areas, should be restricted, but that we shouldn't simply outlaw Israel from defense equipment because it had a legitimate defense concern.
So I suppose the ultimate question, and you've partly answered this, is whether or not it's justified for the UK to be giving this amount of weapons to Israel, and whether you think there is some kind of double standard from a Western perspective.
Well, on the basis of what I've read, I think had I been in the government, I would probably have sought restrictions sooner and more substantially. But I do recognise the complexity of the issue. It's not straightforward. About double standard, well, the world is, of course there are double standards, and this whole war is not helping the cause of the West broadly, because we are supporting a fairly aggressive response to terrorism. But if other countries respond to terrorism aggressively, we then give them big lectures. I mean, China and Xinjiang is a good example. So, yeah, we are setting ourselves up for criticism. And it's very clear that most of the countries in the so-called global south have been alienated from the West as a result of the commitments that have been made in respect of Israel.
Israeli airstrikes have struck Gaza's biggest hospital.
There's a clear indication that there's looser standards being applied to arms being supplied there.
Had I been in the government, I would probably have sought restrictions sooner. If we're going to restore public services, which are terribly battered in many areas, people are going to have to pay. Stop worrying about tuition fees. It's a form of graduate income tax. One shouldn't be scaremongering about that.
Why do you think the West feel threatened by China?
The ability of the United States to run the world has been undermined by China's growth. China now has a bigger economy than the United States.